It's now my pleasure to introduce Abe Gelbart, Bard College's David and Rosalie Rose Distinguished Professor of Natural Sciences and Mathematics and founder of this series. Abe received his bachelor's degree from Dalhousie University and his PhD from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. A former member of the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, Abe is known for his mathematical development of the theory of pseudo-analytical functions. He is Dean Emeritus of the Belfer Graduate School of Science at Yeshiva University and has recently been honored by Bar-Ilan University in Israel, which has named a professorship in mathematics after him. With much gratitude and respect, I give you Dr. Gelbart.
It seems that the first person on the stage doesn't get himself properly introduced. So I would like to say a couple of words about Professor Ferguson. He's professor of biology at Bard College and has been most helpful and very active in the support of the lecture series. As you may remember him, he has done some beautiful work in the seminars before the lectures, those that are the seminars held in the morning before the afternoon lecture. He's done a superb job of that, to the point where there have been many requests for tapes and videotapes to be made of the morning seminars, and that's all thanks to him. He received his PhD degree from Yale University. He's published many research papers, has lectured at many other institutions around the country, and again, I want to thank him very much for the enormous help he has been in making sure that this lecture series is a success. So, thank you. This is the 10th year of the Distinguished Scientist Lecture Series, as our friend has mentioned, and it may be regarded as an anniversary of the first decade of our program. So perhaps a few words about the beginning of this series and some reminiscing might be appropriate. So forgive me if I go into a little bit of background of the beginning of this lecture series. I came to Bard in 1979, 10 years ago, just after retiring from a few years at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton. I was at the Institute on other occasions also, the first being in 1947, some time ago. At that time, my family and I moved into a duplex apartment. They had separate buildings, duplexes, of the Institute Housing Project. It was my rare good fortune that the other occupant of the duplex was Professor Paul Dirac of Cambridge, England, and his family. As you know, he's died a couple of years ago, was one of the most outstanding scientists of the 20th century. Professor Dirac had the reputation of being very reticent and as having made very few friends, mostly because he was incapable of participating in small talk, and in general, not being able to speak much except when he lectured. However, in some strange way, Professor Dirac and I developed a very close friendship. He loved strolling through the woods, any woods he could find anywhere. And on one occasion, and on more than one occasion, I'm sorry, he and I would walk through the woods for a solid hour without exchanging a single word. He was famous for such things. Our friendship was such that whenever he was in the vicinity of New York, he would be our house guest. That's in New York City. In 1979, just after my arrival at Bard, was one of the occasions that he and Mrs. Dirac stayed in our New York apartment. He was curious about the new school, especially about my association with it. Being British, he had never heard of Bard College, but when I told him it was set deep in the woods of upstate New York, moment woods is mentioned, he was eager to visit the campus. I told him I would take him there on one condition, that he honor us with a lecture. After some protesting, he agreed. Since he was staying with us just a few days, we didn't have the time to prepare and send out notices of his lecture. For what the administration at Bard did, it must be highly complimented. It sent telegrams to all the schools and research laboratories within 100 miles, including New York and Boston. People came by the busloads, and many just to see this great scientist. The audience numbered just about 1,000. We had no room for them. This auditorium had not been built, but we were able to fit them into the student cafeteria when everything was removed, and we put lots of movable chairs in. They stood around the sides. They stood in the halls. We tried to get a loudspeaker into the halls so that they could hear the scientist speak. And his lecture turned out to be a tremendous success. There was a demand for more lectures of that kind. We applied for a grant for the National Science Foundation for this purpose, and we're told that if we could get more lecturers like him, of course there were few like him, but we told them, we assured them we'd be able to get very distinguished lecturers. They would support us with sufficient funds. We received a substantial grant from the foundation, the National Science Foundation, and thus started the Distinguished Scientist Lecture Series. After 2 successful years came the Reagan cuts. There was a tremendous cut in the budget of the National Science Foundation. Fortunately, the National Patent Development Corporation stepped in and has remained our mainstay for our support. The stature of our lectures has in no way diminished over the years. Today, we have with us a very distinguished mathematician. He will be our 65th speaker and the 5th mathematician in this series. We have been fortunate in that we have been able to attract many Nobel laureates and scientists of Nobel laureate stature. As you know, there is no Nobel Prize in the field of mathematics. Although one of our mathematicians, Herbert Hauptmann, who was a speaker last year in this series, did work in mathematics that led to a very important result in medicine. And though a mathematician, the Nobel Committee awarded him the Nobel Prize, but it had to do it in the field of medicine, though he lists himself and functions as a mathematician. David Bryant Mumford, our speaker today, did not receive the Nobel Prize since he was a mathematician, but he did receive the Fields Medal, which in my opinion is perhaps a greater distinction than that of the Nobel Award. It is given, decided upon by an international committee of mathematicians once in every 4 years to those who have done the most basic research in their respective fields of mathematics. Professor Mumford was born in Three Bridges, Sussex, England, and came to this country at a very early age. He received his bachelor's degree, magna cum laude, in 1957, and his PhD degree in 1961, both from Harvard University. After earning these degrees, he became an instructor and research fellow in mathematics at Harvard. And except for visiting positions at other important centers of research in science and mathematics, he has remained a member of the Harvard faculty until now. Early in his career, he became a member of the Institute for Advanced Study, and for a brief period was visiting professor there, an unusual distinction also. Some of his other visiting positions, and I'll name just a couple of them, were in Paris and the Tata Institute for Fundamental Research in Bombay, India. He is a member of the Society of Fellows of Harvard University. Professor Mumford has written at least 10 books and more than 50 research papers. For his important research in mathematics and in applied mathematics, he has received many honors and awards, among them, as mentioned, the prestigious Fields Medal, and an honorary doctorate also from Warwick University. He is now a MacArthur Foundation Fellow, an unusual distinction for any scientist or scholar. It is a great honor and a pleasure to introduce Professor David Bryant Mumford, who will speak on what is seen and how come computers cannot do it while we can. Professor Mumford.
Thank you, Professor Gelbart. I'd like to thank Bard College for inviting me, and I hope to be able to entertain you a little bit about a problem that I think is still almost completely unsolved, but which I think is possibly to me is exciting because it seems one of the most accessible ways to get directly to what makes human thinking different from the operations of a computer or the ideas of mathematical logic. Let me just begin. Thinking here, I might. Recently, there's been a rapprochement between people working in a lot of different areas, centering around the cognitive sciences. Traditionally, the people studying the brain from the point of view of psychology with its bag of tricks, the people studying the brain from the point of view of the biology, so let's call these the neurobiologists, neurophysiologists, neurologists included, and on the other hand, the computer scientists trying to understand how, with hardware, thought processes can be carried out. So we'll put computer science down here. These three fields have all begun talking to each other in many conferences and seminars, and people are attempting to learn each other's points of view in order to share insights and possibly get deeper into the understanding of the way people think. The psychologists have, the cognitive psychologists in particular can do experiments such as looking at people's reaction time and in being able to carry out some task. The neurobiologists, of course, can get right down to the nitty-gritty and try to see what the individual cells are doing. And the computer scientists, they have a unique advantage that they can start from scratch and in a computer attempt to simulate whatever theoretically we think might be going on in the brain. And by using all these three techniques together, really I think a new field is being created, whose goal really is understanding not only what people do, as a psychologist might say, we understand what this theory explains, how people are thinking, but understanding in the sense that you can eventually bring together, on the one hand, a completely artificial simulation, a machine which is able to duplicate human performance with the sorts of tasks we're confronted with, which the explanation should go down to the cellular level and say exactly what the neurons are doing that allows this output to take place. And of course it should also explain what we're doing in the gross way that psychologists study it from the outside in terms of our performance and our capabilities. I was drawn to vision for the simple reason that this is, first of all, as a mathematician, I've been studying geometry all my career and was attracted to things which have some spatial aspect, but also because vision seems to be an ability which can be solved by brains much smaller than those of human beings. A pigeon, for example, is extremely good at seeing, and no bird could impose the picture into the objects present. So, for example, with the cow in front of the tree, let me put her back up. I knew this was going to happen. Oh yeah, here it is. With a cow in front of the tree, one would like to segment this picture and say, all right, there's the ground, there's the tree, there's the cow with legs and head. So that would be the segmentation of that picture. Well, I'm going to run through for you with a series of overlays here how people think this roughly is accomplished. The first step is to be a little more careful about the edges in the picture, thin them down by something called non-maximum suppression, try to continue them into longer edges. This is an existing computer program. What I'm going to show you is a mixture of existing programs that computers can carry out and hopes and rational reconstructions of what we think the brain is doing, but computer programs cannot yet do in order to go further. All right, where are we here? Oh, here we go. So now at this point, we have the lines. Oh my gosh, which is which? Got this. All right. All right. Now, wait a minute. Oh yeah, here we go. What? This is not matching up. Okay. Now what we tried it. This is what the computer. Oh, okay. The computer program we're working a little better. Notice that the ground is still not complete there. You see, the gradient was too low. You really have to look for evidence. You know that edges usually don't stop in the middle of nowhere, so you try to complete them and use weak continuations of the edges and use information about that a dark region next to a light region, you ought to be able to find a continuous outline and not an interrupted one. So some of the edges have been filled in this step. This is what we hope this edge operator ought to be able to do were it more effective. Now, wait a minute. Where did this go? Oh, I see. Oh, okay. Now, here is another step that the eye makes. The eye really sees that this tree is different from here. I think without knowing anything about the content of the picture, this is a speckled region, and this is a much darker region. There's a texture discontinuity between here and here. This is something people are trying to do by computer, but which is much harder to pick up, to see that the texture difference. Likewise, there's a very weak edge present in the original picture. You can see clearly there's a lighter line between the head and the body. So, and this edge started to go down there. The program should have looked for continuations and found the rest of that edge. So one would hope that the program would find these edges. At this point, the next thing you look for, this is a very interesting insight that seems to have come from about, I'm going to tell you now, what I'm going to show you next is a very beautiful example of how psychology, neurophysiology, and computer vision can work together and come up with the same insight. The next step in really seeing, and this does seem to be what, in seeing what's going on in the picture, are looking for T-junctions. Now, by a T-junction, what I mean is, let me use my pen here. There is a line here, and then a line that comes down to it that stops. So that's like the letter T. Now, typically, why do you see in the world letter T's? They are actually, if I put my hand in front of the lectern, the edge of the lectern comes and it stops at my hand. In other words, it reveals that my hand is in front of the lectern. This is a magnificent clue to the three-dimensional world. A picture, that, as you see it, is a two-dimensional, is only a two-dimensional thing, and it doesn't immediately reveal anything about the three-dimensional world. But let me try to find this example. Where is it? But it's been known to psychologists for a long time that T's in a picture produce an extremely strong illusion of depth. Let me go to psychology now. What I want to show you is that the strength of these T's in the picture as being included three dimensions is quite fantastic. This is from the Gestalt School of Psychology. The only difference between these two pictures, the black areas are absolutely identical in all of them. The only small difference between these two pictures is that this line is present here, and this line is present here. You see, instead of these two lines, you have these two lines. So these thin lines are added here and are not present there. See, the result is that instead of there being, in this case, a T here, it goes the other way around. The T goes there. So this line goes behind. This is therefore perceived in front, and this goes behind, and your mind completes this into a semicircle that is behind the cross. In this case, the T goes this way, and you complete the line that way, and you see a square. But the black areas are identical in those two pictures. But you reconstruct the three-dimensional picture totally differently in the two cases because the T-junctions have been changed. Amazingly, just a few years ago, this is going to be chaos soon. Anyway, the neurophysiologists picked up climbed on the same bandwagon, and some people in Switzerland putting their electrodes into the brains of live monkeys. It's a very nasty business, but it's what they do. Showed. Now, what's happening here is this. You see, if you look up here. Look at this one. This is a well-known illusion where if you see these three Pac-Men and you see these triangles here, I hope it works for you with this rather small version. There's a strong tendency to see a line across here, to see a triangle, which is white, but which causes this triangle to disappear there and takes this little bite out of the circles. In other words, you mentally imagine that there's a line going across there, even though it's not there in the picture. Well, the point is, this is very similar to the reconstruction of those missing lines, which in this picture, which were behind. You see, in this picture, you actually see in your mind's eye that there's a line across there, but it's hidden by this object in front. Okay, so and in this case, the line goes across there, but it's hidden by the object in front. So the reconstruction of these hidden lines, that is the process of going to a three-dimensional view of the world, turns out you can actually find it in neurons in the brain of a monkey firing. And this is how it works. This is what's called the receptive field moving across here, and this is the firing of the neuron. Here there's no edge, but by continuing that line you create an edge, a so-called illusory edge, and the neurons are still firing here. So that, in any case, what this shows is that you can actually trace, I'm sorry, the slide, the transparency isn't very clear, but it shows that you can trace this sort of reconstruction process as being a reality in the brain of the monkey. Okay, let's go. And as I say then, from a computational point of view, this seems to be exactly what's necessary in order to solve real-life problems. Let me go to this example, because this is the state of the art in applications of computer vision. In this picture, one really would like to have a machine which would read those letters I and O in that picture. Let me turn around so I O is right side up, make it clearer. Okay, now what the computer can do with those so-called edge operators I was showing you earlier is to go that far. That's what can be done. Now, if we imagine that the computer, and this is actually a graduate student working on this right now, if the computer were able to follow the weaker edges, it's not unreasonable to think that the computer would actually come up with this by tracing the edges more carefully. At that point, the T junctions are very clear, and you see the I and the O pop out because we know that the T junctions mean that the horizontal lines are in back, so we get rid of those as being in the back plane, and in the front plane, I/O appears immediately as being the... and I hope I've also made it clear that computers have made a good start, but they really they are a very long way away still from duplicating human abilities. Well, let me just say that when I gave a similar lecture to this about 6 months ago, and after I was finished, this guy came up out of the audience and said, "Do you remember me?" And I couldn't remember him. But I'd met him once before, and turned out he's a card-carrying computer vision guy working in this lab right around the corner. I'd forgotten he was working there. And then he told me what he had succeeded in doing, and I was absolutely, it took my breath away. I think this really is the state of the art and a magnificent achievement. Now the Nielsen company, when they want to count how many people are watching a TV show, they buy from this man, Peter Burt, and the Sarnoff Labs, a box that sits on top of your TV that looks at you. It has a camera looking at you, looking at the TV. And his program apparently sufficiently accurately to satisfy the Nielsen people counts how many people are watching the TV. And I believe he does it by identifying your eyes and counting the number of eyes looking at the TV. I don't know if you put a mask in front of the sofa, probably it would say there was another person watching. But I think that shows that the field is making quite amazing progress. And maybe in 50 years we'll be able to identify that there's a cow munching the grass in front of the tree. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Mumford. You see another example, a surprising example, of what mathematicians do. It's unbelievable. You thought you'd have the blackboard be full of equations. It isn't. Thank you. Fascinating. Absolutely fascinating. Professor Mumford has agreed to a question and answer period. And when that's over, I would like to make a few announcements, just a few. So the floor is open for any of you who want to address questions to me.
Yeah.
Do you know of any paperback book about illusions?
Oh.
Any paperback book about illusions? Illusions which illustrate the kinds of problems of perception that
Yeah,
distinguish human minds from computers?
I'm not sure of one that specifically concentrates on illusions, but there's a very nice paperback by psychologist Gregory called something like Seeing, something like that, which goes over a lot of this sort of material and does have, in passing, many of these illusions. Yeah.
The basic thing we're talking about the computer being able to simulate vision.
Right.
With a number of mechanical endeavors, rather than having the machine duplicate what the human body does, they've decided that a piece of machinery can attack a problem from another direction, and so the machinery and the technology is more efficient. Here you've been talking about simulating human capability of vision. Trying to create machine vision. Does that appear to be the most efficient way to go at it with the hardware we have now, or the hardware we have now can go at it from another direction?
It's really unclear. I mean, that's a very good point, and there's a lot of debate about that. But certainly in the last, I would say for the last 5 years, the trend has definitely been to get hardware that that is closer to the human brain. For example, the major thrust with hardware has been looking for parallel hardware as opposed to serial hardware, where this is a fundamental distinction is whether or not you have to attack a process, a problem by one step at a time and completing the first step before you go on to the next step to the next step. Or can you do a whole set of steps simultaneously, look at the results of all of those, and then decide to do another whole set of steps simultaneously? So that the second one is the parallel. You have many soldiers marching in parallel. And the brain is the most highly parallel. Every neuron is working all the time. And the trend in hardware has been definitely to go towards parallel machines. This began, one of the earliest of these are parallel machines that did this early vision, did things like this edge detection, and there were boards, and various companies made special purpose computers for doing exactly this early vision in parallel. But now there are also many general purpose parallel machines, such as the connection machine. So in that sense, I think there's a tendency to imitate what bodies do. On the other hand, there are certain capabilities which clearly machines do have, which really it seems hard to imagine how bodies can have them. One of those is in computers the use of pointers. A computer has the advantage that it's made very carefully, and it knows the address of every single register, and it can just say, the CPU can say, I want to know what register 8,345,000 has inside it. The brain, the way it grows, the cells don't seem to sort of have individual names. It's grown to a certain extent apparently by a stochastic process, and there doesn't seem to be any mechanism so far by which the brain has a mechanism of pointers for talking about the contents, for one neuron talking about the contents of another neuron at a totally different part of the brain. The brain has to rely on the connections which it was born with, essentially, or possibly grew, if you talk about some of this work on the hippocampus. But that seems to be a major difference. So I think yes and no. There seem to be some ways in which it seems a really good idea to try to imitate what the brain is doing, but otherwise we definitely seem to be able to do some things that the brain can't. Yeah?
How well do you think the computer will be able to eliminate marginal impertinent information? Let me be specific. I am looking at you, my eye is seeing the side exit. The brain can do it in the hypothalamus and so forth, so that by the time it gets to the computerizing section, it does process pertinent information. Will the computer ever be able to do that? Speaking of your cookies, that it will be...
Well, this is definitely a mechanism that people have incorporated in a lot of the programs they're using, the idea of attention. In fact, an earlier program of Peter Bird's that I was to do parking lot surveillance, and they had, what they did was they would look at pictures of the parking lot every 1/10 of a second and look at the differences. And they would look at where there were the biggest differences, and then they would zero in on the place where there was a difference. A little window that was just big enough to contain that where there was a change, and it would then send as clear a picture as it could of that window that only sampled a small number of spots there to another stage for special processing. So in other words, there was a window of attention mechanism built into this. And this certainly seems to be the way to go. But in that case, they used the motion to say where it was they wanted to look. In your case, you say, how do I know that? Well, of course, I am moving and the background isn't. So, in fact, you could probably do that with that mechanism. But in other cases, your attention is drawn by subtler things. Actually, I didn't show this transparency, which is one of my favorites, but I didn't get to this. This particular experiment is sort of a droll one. It takes people on the average about half a second, if shown the bottom picture as opposed to the top, before their attention is drawn to the one piece that doesn't belong. I think would be pretty obvious to you, huh? In other words, the people pick out that octopus. You see, the octopus, the fact that it doesn't belong is purely semantic information about what objects you find in the world. You find tractors in barnyards and not octopi. And it takes people only about half a second glancing at that. The median reaction time, I think, before foveating on the octopus was half a second, which is very striking. It shows that within half a second, the people have basically absorbed the whole content of that scene and figured out the one thing that didn't belong. So we can't do that yet. So that's high-level attention. Yeah.
There is in the near future no chance to make a computer that has the same number of components as the
Right.
brain as neurons.
Right.
Now, if we look at, say, insects, which by necessity have not far fewer neurons, they seem, especially insects of prey or insects that have escaped during
Right.
feats of vision, and they have resorted to these composite eyes. Would there be a hint there that with combining many more pictures simultaneously with fewer processing neurons, one could get further than having a single eye, which is essentially what you have been talking about?
Well, I think the output of the...
We have with a single eye look at the picture and studying it in depth.
The composite eye of the insect, the output of that is not that different from our eyes, because although it is a composite eye with these many little ocelli, I think they're called, each one simply records the average intensity of light coming from a fixed direction. So that composite eye is taking the whole scene and breaking it up into many little facets and reporting to the brain the average intensity of the world as seen in each of those directions. And that's not unlike what's my handout or what's coming out of the human retina. The retina goes a little further in that it does a certain amount of differencing. Actually, the confusing part is that the mammalian retina already begins computing on the picture, and so it's not delivering the raw intensity up to the brain. But I think in answer to your other question, there is a whole. There are people who are precisely trying to duplicate skills of the order of magnitude of insects. There's a group at MIT which has it says on the door AI lab, but in little letters it says artificial insect lab. And they're exactly trying to duplicate much more primitive abilities, and in particular the ability to react very fast to things that change. So you don't try to predict the whole environment, and like a chess playing program tries to think as deeply as possible before it does anything. That's certainly not the way we move around in the world. We have to react every second. So that's exactly the kind of ability, this sort of adaptive planning that they're trying to understand. And that I think that approach is turning out to be very useful. Yeah.
This should be limited to the optical wavelengths, or is it also being done in infrared areas?
The Army has a lot of, likes to use these infrared pictures because of night vision. They're very blurry pictures though, and it's hard to use them. That's the only work I know of. Well actually, and another curious thing about birds though is that there's some evidence that birds make use of other frequencies, ultraviolet frequencies, and that instead of having 3 primary colors, they use a much more like a 7 or 8 primary colors. They have another system from ours based on these oil droplets in front of their retina, and they seem to see a much more colorful world than we do. But I don't know. I think there may be people who've tried that with computers. I don't know. Yeah.
Speaking about the military has for many years been using expert systems for image processing, low-flying aircraft, and distinguishing the target acquisition. And many of the situations that we're talking about come up in target acquisition, where you have to distinguish what's a legitimate target or not.
What's the last thing? What acquisition?
Target acquisitions using image processing
Yeah.
computers for low-flying aircraft.
Yes.
Which sounds, and the expert systems themselves have evolved into artificial intelligence, which is using symbolic processing.
Right.
So all of these things seem to be consistent with the kinds of research you've been doing, except there's a lot of military secrecy associated with that.
Yeah. No, certainly the military has been the major source of funding for most of the research. I mean, the MIT's AI lab, I think, has been supported by DARPA grants for principally for years. My only comment about that is that I think that the military temperament is to a certain extent incompatible with basic science. They want applications very fast, and the result is they tend to go through cycles of falling head over heels to support some promising, fancy new piece of technology and pouring billions of dollars into something, and then if in a couple of years it hasn't immediately worked out, pulling back completely and everything falls in its face. And it's a ludicrous way to do things. I mean, the Army recently, after putting I don't know how many millions of dollars into what was called the Autonomous Land Vehicle Program, or DARPA I guess it is, totally pulled out of it because they were getting impatient. And now they're pouring all that money into neural nets, which is, I think, very, very premature for applications, in my opinion. So I think it's a bit of a farce to watch the military chase after the latest darling that comes out of artificial intelligence research. So Gilbert and Sullivan, yeah.
Almost everything you talked about was digital computing, but isn't there some evidence that the brain works much more on analog?
Yeah, definitely. It has that look to it. A lot of it has that look to it. One of the difficulties is that there's a kind of a standard model of how the brain works that goes back to McCulloch and Pitts, and that the evidence has been piling up from many, many places that model is incomplete and it's much more complicated than that. And at this point, no one, I think, has, in any sense, a generally accepted computational model of what the neuron is really doing. And so it's very hard to know to what extent it's analog and to what extent it's digital. But there's also been a big resurgence of interest in analog computation, optical analog computation, for instance. And it's very the possibility of doing exceedingly parallel computation with optical procedures is very enticing. So, but I think it's just, at the moment, there's just a lot of experimentation. Yeah.
I think one of the things that's important to consider is that vision really depends upon our first differencing, taking one image and comparing to the subsequent image, and taking the difference to see the changes.
Yes.
And in particular, I know of a young lady who, when she was a baby, had retinal degeneration, that is, her fovea centralis was gone, and all she had was rod vision. And when you watch this little kid who was trying to cope in this world, what she was doing was scanning her eyeball whenever she looked at something. So she was actually scanning over edges to see.
Right. That's very interesting. Yeah, yeah. No, I mean, I didn't touch on motion at all, but it's clear that this is very, very crucial for the identification of objects. For instance, the relative movement. If you move slightly, objects move against the background. And the Gibsons in particular felt that this was
moving target identification.
Right.
MTI.
Right. Absolutely. No, this certainly is. Yeah.
Is anything being done with all this experimentation to help the visually handicapped? Is anything coming out of that?
Trying to think whether I know of. I mean, for instance, I know that there was a marvelous machine that a reader for blind people, which works by a little array of photosensitive cells that you move across the type, and then put your hand in, and things poke up. The whole array of rods pokes up and produces a tactile version of the retinal intensity image. But I haven't. No, in fact, I don't know of too much. But maybe I just haven't come across it.